Here we go again. This is week 2, lecture 2, part 2. Leaving off part 1 with the schism and what to do about it. Now, the schism has been seen as this watershed in Europe, so that even we can talk about the pre-schism and post-schism almost as a demarcation of periodization. That's not that big of an issue. We can see it that way, but I just wanted to emphasize the impact that the schism had. And again, as I ended part 1, the question was what to do about it, because the two popes are in competition. They're not going to say, okay, I will concede to the other pope. And that was the problem. They weren't willing to do that. It became clear that the only way to end the schism was to call a church council. Now, there have been church councils before. In general, the idea was that a church council had authority when it was being held in conjunction with the pope. But this was the first time, really ever, that it was realized that there isn't a pope to sanction and give authority to this council. We need to kind of take matters on our own. We, archbishops, bishops, powerful abbots, leaders and leaders of monastic orders, as well as the princes of Europe, the kings and the emperor himself, because the church council was everybody. I mean, one of the basic definitions of the church that both Marcellus of Padua and Augustinus of Ancona, for example, both professed was that the church most fundamentally is the communion of the faithful, communio fidelis, or fidelium, communion of the faithful, which includes everybody. The question was, who was in charge? Now, papal theorists did argue that even though that is the basic definition of the church can also refer to the institutional hierarchy. Now, I want to stress this because that term church is very problematic. And if we talk about church state, I think I've said this before, that is a false dichotomy. But if we talk about the institutional ecclesiastical hierarchy, there certainly was a conflict, not between the state, but with the temporal hierarchy, going back to the lectures for last week. There was a conflict over power and authority within the church as a whole, which was within Christendom as a whole. And so the leaders, the political leaders, ecclesiastical and lay, realized we have to have a pope of some sort. We need to have a council to deal with this. So they called together a council to meet at Pisa in 1409. Now, the schism by this time had already been going on, 20 years? 21 years. Calling a church council is difficult. Just think logistically. Meeting in one city, Pisa. We have to have all the leaders, the ecclesiastical leaders, and most of the lay leaders there all come together. The provisions for all of them have to be brought there. I mean, it's a huge undertaking. And at Pisa, they got together and they said, okay, we are going to elect a new pope. That's what we have to do. We can't figure this out. What we'll do is, we'll tell both of the Afghanese pope and the Roman pope that they have to resign, which is possible. We know that, Celestine V resigned. That's an option. So they'll both resign and we'll elect the new pope. So let's get on with electing the new pope, because that's the major task of this council. So they did elect the new pope. I forget exactly the name. I think it's Benedict the 12th. I'm not sure. I have to look that up. Sorry about that. Now, you can probably see a problem here. Benedict the 12th, let's say, the Pisan Pope. The Pisan Pope believed he was Pope. If you're the Afghanese Pope, which of course is no longer Clement VII, I forget who was the name of the Afghanese Pope or the Roman Pope at the time. They believe they're Pope. So are they going to resign? No, I'm the valid Pope. I want to be Pope. I like being Pope. It's good to be Pope. I'm not going to resign. Same thing with the Roman Pope. What happened? All of a sudden now we had three popes because there was enough support behind the Council of Pisa and the election of the Pisan Pope that Europe just split again. And even if it wasn't the majority of Europe, or even, 50-50, it was never a 50-50 split, but enough political support for the Pisan Pope, they have three factions. Oh my God, this two-headed monster has now become a three-headed monster. Oh my God, what do we do about it? And it's like, well, we blew it. We need to have another council and do it right this time. With the support and help of Emperor Sigismund. This will be important later on. Who was emperor at the time? Sigismund, with his capital in Prague. Also important. We're going to have a council, another general council of the church, called for to meet in Constance in 1414. So we at least have approximately 4 years to get ready for it. So they do. They call together and they have a general council. Starts at Constance in 1414 and will sit until 1418. Not continuously 7 days a week, 365 days a year, the different sessions, but still the Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418. They realized they had to do something first before they elected a new pope. They had to establish the authority of the council to settle the issue. So they did a couple of things. They issued a decree, Haec Sancta, on the slide. This holy synod. It's also called Sancta Synodus, but that's Haec Sancta. In this document, they proclaim the council as the highest authority within the church. This was a radical departure because the theory always before, which even the imperial theory, the theory that supported the lay rulers, didn't necessarily object to this idea. But the idea was that we have Christ as the head of the church. Everybody also agreed with that. There's two things that everybody agreed with. Christ is the head of the church, and the church is defined as the communio fidelium, community of the faithful. But Christ is in heaven. Therefore, the vicar of Christ is the Pope. Christ's power goes through the Pope to the rest of the church. Now, if you're on the imperial side, you still accept that. You just say, yeah, but Christ is also, I'm also the vicar of Christ in some way. I'm ruling for God. And so it's like, what's the relationship between the temporal lay authority hierarchy and the ecclesiastical clerical ordained hierarchy? And for Marsilius, it's definitely this way, and that the ecclesiastical hierarchy is to serve the lay hierarchy. For Augustinus of Ancona and proponents of the papal position, it's the other way around. What the conciliar position became, as it became known as conciliarism, was that no, it's Christ, the council, and the Pope rules not directly as Christ's vicar necessarily, although we can call him that, but as kind of the CEO of the church. And the council is the board of trustees and the board of directors combined. So that the power goes from Christ to the council to the Pope. Radical departure. Proclaiming that then gave the council the authority to deal with the schism. Because then you're just dealing with an underling, so to speak. Now, they then proclaimed all three popes deposed. We're getting rid of the popes by fiat. They are no longer pope. We have established ourselves as the authority. The popes work for us, so to speak. We are firing them all. And then they waited before electing a new pope. They said, we are going to finish business here. Issued Haec Sancta. They said, because, too, the council is now the highest authority in the church, we need to make sure that we take our responsibilities seriously. So there are going to be periodic councils to ensure everything is in good order. And they issued the decree also in 1415, frequens, which just is the Latin for frequent. And what did frequens do? Frequens said, okay, when we finish up our work here in Constance, there will be another General Council of the Church to meet in 5 years. When that council is completed, the next General Council will meet in 7 years. Thinking that by that time, they will have improved things already now. In 5 years, they'll check and see how things are going. And then hopefully things will be okay. So then give it a little bit more time in 7 years. And then when that council is finished, there'll be a council, General Council, in 10 years. And then every 10 years, there will be a General Council of the Church. Now, this position, with Haec Sancta and then frequens, to ensure the structure needed to maintain the good health and running of the church, is known as conciliarism. The position that the council is the highest authority within the church. Now, be that as it may, the Council of Constance also did other things besides just doing this. I have there Jan Hus, because they also dealt with that, because there was heresy, the schism and heresy. One of the biggest concerns was this movement that was starting and causing worry, concern in Bohemia. The Kingdom of Bohemia, keep in mind, is one of the electors. Emperor Sigismund was the king of Bohemia before he became emperor. Capital in Prague. Was led by a man named Jan Hus. Hus was a master of theology and teacher at the University of Prague. So he was an academic, but he was also a popular preacher. And there were a number of issues that they thought that he was problematic with. He was advocating for communion in both kinds, the cup and the bread. So keep in mind, the tradition had been that the laity, when they received communion, they only received the bread. They did not receive the cup. They did not receive the wine. This was a practical issue. It was not. No one said that this was the way Jesus had intended it. It was based on the following: the doctrine of transubstantiation, which had been established at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, was such that the elements of the bread and the wine, at the moment of consecration, became the actual physical body and blood of Christ in substance, even though the accidents of bread and wine remain. So that still tastes like bread, look like bread, tastes like wine, look like wine. But the substance is based on Aristotelian philosophy, physics. The substance had changed. All of a sudden, it's like, this is Christ's body and blood. What if, one of these peasants dribbles Christ's blood all over them? That's not right. So we have to be very careful. What if they spill bread all over? That's not right. So what we'll do, we will place the bread in their mouths, and they don't get the cup. It's more likely that they would spill the cup or the dribble down blood on them from the cup than it is that they would, have crumbs from the bread if we're careful with it. So that was the point. But here's Huss arguing that no, the laity should receive both the cup and the wine, just like the priest did. Also, Huss had written treatises on the church, his major treatise on the church, which seemed to be heretical. It seemed to question the supremacy of the papacy and the authority within the church. Kind of followed his argument that there's not a divine hierarchy, so to speak. And also, he seemed to be following a lot of the ideas of John Wycliffe, who was English in the later 14th century, who had already died, was suspect but had never been condemned of heresy as such, but was seen as a heretic. And so we need to kind of find out, what does Master Huss really believe? We need to get him to talk. So they sent an invitation to Huss to say, come to the Council of Constance. We just want to talk with you. And Huss said, I can smell a witch hunt. This is before there were any witch hunts. Uh, that's a later development. That's another issue. I can smell a witch hunt when I see it. I'm not going to go there. When Emperor Sigismund stepped in, said Master Huss, I will promise you safe conduct. I will grant you safe conduct to the council, meaning you will have imperial protection. With that promise, Huss said, okay, I'll come and talk. So Huss goes to Constance. He arrives. There's strenuous preaching against him. He's condemned of heresy and burned at the stake. The theory was, well, yeah, okay, he had imperial safe conduct. How can we burn him? Well, it's like he's a condemned heretic now. You don't, it's not valid to give safe conduct to a heretic. He's burned at the stake. That was what the council did. Now, again, I think I may have addressed this earlier, but the idea of burning heretics, which only began really to be a practice in the early 14th century, was one that was needed. Now, I'm not advocating burning heretics, but when you think about it, why? It was a surgical operation because a heretic could infect other people. And what would that mean? They would be going to hell. If you are a heretic, you don't get into heaven. Let's say, go to hell, go directly to hell, do not collect $200. And if we allow them to flourish, they're a cancer that affects the salvation of anyone they come into contact with. Again, we have the death penalty today. Not universally necessarily, but places, still states that still do have the death penalty. We don't think that, well, I know there's a controversial doctrine, period. But the idea of killing people who have committed such a crime is something that we can sort of deal with and acknowledge. A heretic is far worse. A heretic is far worse than Charles Manson or Jeffrey Dahmer or any other people. Why? Because a heretic affects your eternal salvation, not just your physical. So what, you get killed? Yeah, that's not necessarily, oh, yay. Oh, I was murdered and eaten. Ooh, that's not good. But it doesn't affect your salvation. Heresy affects your salvation. And if we, the powers that be, are responsible for our subjects, can we allow a heretic to live? Now, there's different levels and conditions, so to speak, within there. You can have heretical or doctrines proclaimed to be heretical. So there can be a theologian who is censured, whose certain positions are proclaimed heretical, even though the theologian is not proclaimed a heretic. Does that make sense? So putting to death a heretic is an extreme measure, even at the time it was. It's only really an unrepentant heretic who refuses to accept the judgment, who would be subject to the death penalty, essentially. Doesn't mean they all said, oh, I see the light now and agree. Peter Abelard, back in the 11th century, was censured, and some of his positions were deemed heretical. He was not burned. He went along with it, even though he didn't believe it for a second. Even though he was wrong, but he went along with it. But a heretic is different. Huss was deemed a heretic, therefore had to be surgically removed from the body of Christ, lest he continued to infect the body of Christ with the cancer of heresy, thus jeopardizing the internal salvation of its members. Now, be that as it may. Supposedly, Huss made the statement as he was on the stake or going to the stake. You may burn this goose. And goose, I mean, I don't know Czech, but supposedly that statement, burn this goose, was a reference in Czech to his name, Huss. I don't know if Huss really means goose in Czech. I don't know Czech, so I can't say that, but supposedly that's what it was referring to. You may burn this goose, but a reformer is coming. A swan is coming, whom you will not be able to put down. A prophecy of a reformer to come. A swan who would come. That's going to be important for us later on. It's important for understanding Huss. It also indicates the sentiment, because this is not simply Huss feeling this way. This is Huss as the leader of a movement that felt this way. And actually, the Hussites, as they became known as, split into two groups. One more radical, who, let's say, adhered to a thoroughly hardcore following of all the doctrines of Huss. Whereas they're the Taborites, and the Utraquists were the other form, and they were just kind of wanting married clergy and communion of both kinds. Those were granted by the council to the Utraquists, but not to the Taborites. So there's still this kind of more radical faction in Bohemia that they had to be aware of. They compromised with the Utraquists, the more moderate followers of Huss, and they go from there. Now, what happens? What happens thereafter? Because the Council of Constance, after burning Huss, after issuing Haec Sancta and Frequens, dealing with the other business before the council, it was only towards the end that they then elected the new pope, which they did, and elected Martin V as pope. And then they closed up shop, proclaimed their job well done, and disbanded with Martin the new fifth. Now, put yourself in the shoes of Martin. All of a sudden, you're pope. Great. The other three popes were deposed. There were some straggling remnants of support, but essentially they could bellow all they wanted. People were tired of this schism. But Martin is like, wait a minute. I'm not a conciliar father. I'm not really all keen with this. I'll go along with it because, I want to be pope. I'm going to start trying to, slowly gain back power and authority. So that the process was already starting with the election of Martin. When Martin took office, it's like, okay, I'm pope now. What can I do? Given that, we go back to Frequens. Constance ends in 1418. According to Frequens, the next council was supposed to meet then in 5 years, 1423, which it did. Also in Pisa, I believe. Anyway, and they got together in Pisa and said, okay, everything's fine. Things are going pretty well, actually. And they closed up shop in 1424. According to Frequens, next council was to meet in 7 years, which it did in Basel, the Council of Basel in 1431. The Pope at the time was Eugenius III. Now, at this time, Martin and his successors, including Eugenius, had been able to slowly gain more authority back for the papacy. There's still the conciliar position, but the papacy was from the kind of weak position at Constance and in the direct closing of Constance with Martin, had gained back authority over time. And so there's kind of the people who were supporting Eugenius and the people who were supporting the council. And Eugenius had a card in his back pocket. The Council of Basel, they were, again, trying to deal with heresy, with general reform, because the whole call during this period, the call that led to Council of Pisa, the call that led to the Council of Constance, and thereafter was we need to effect a reformation in head and members. a reformation of head and members. And that's what the whole conciliar program was about doing. And the papacy was trying to get back to that view of papal monarchy. That's what we're fighting against. And they had support. Why did they have support? Think about it this way. The General Council, in some ways, was a representative body. The council were the leaders, ecclesiastical and lay, representing the entire Church Universal. To claim that the council, a representative body, had ultimate authority, with the monarch, the Pope, underneath the council, if that theory would have held, what do you do if you're the emperor? What do you do if you're the king of France, or the king of England? You're a monarch. You have representative bodies. In the empire, there's the Diet, the imperial Diet, the Reichstag, which met periodically to advise and help the emperor. In France, there was the Estates Generales, the French Parliament. In England, there was the Parliament. There were representative bodies that served together with the monarch at the pleasure of the monarch. They could only meet if the monarch called them. So they didn't meet, they weren't sitting parliaments. They were parliaments that the king called when needed. In the empire, they met far more frequently than they did in England or in France. Because, again, the empire is an entity that has an elected head. But still, you don't really like the doctrine or the theory of conciliarism because it undermines your position. So there's a lot of support among the heads of state, so to speak. That's a modern term that we really shouldn't use back for this time, for the papal position, and not to adhere too strongly to the conciliar position, because the conciliar position undermined the authority of the European head monarchs, including the emperor. So that's kind of background. Eugenius, I'm pretty sure it was Eugenius the third. I think I said Eugenius the third, didn't I? I hope so. Anyway, Eugenius the third was lucky in some ways. Why was he lucky? Because of an issue that he was able to pull off. Since the Great Schism, not the Great Western Schism, but the Great Schism going back to the split between the Eastern and the Western Church, or the Greek and the Latin Church back in 1054, the official split, there have been desires and hopes to reunite them ever since. Urban II, when he calls for the First Crusade, thought that was an opportunity. There have been calls to let's get together to reunite all of Christendom, not just Christendom in terms of the Latin Church. And finally, in 1431, at the Council of Basel, or during the opening of the Council of Basel, all this stuff, Eugenius had an opportunity because there was a delegation that was sent to Basel from the Patriarch and the Emperor in Constantinople, asking for help. They were being besieged again by the Turk. As I already mentioned, crusading spirit had waned very significantly. But if we could arrange some way to reunite, we could have a united Christian front against the infidel. And at the Council of Basel, Eugenius III, or is it the fourth? It is the fourth. Eugenius IV. I'm sorry. It is Eugenius IV. Eugenius IV was able to pull that off, and reunification was proclaimed. Now, Eugenius then said, I'm going to really reassert my authority over this council. So in 1439, he moved the council from Basel, first to Ferrara, and then to Florence. So Florence, Ferrara. Or maybe it was first Florence and then Ferrara. He moved the council. And with this coup of having achieved reunification with the Greeks, most of the council fathers followed Eugenius. He had reasserted his authority over the church, over his place above the council. Except there was a remnant of council fathers, members of the council, who stayed in Basel and said, Eugenius, screw you. You're affecting another schism. We're going to stay in Basel. This became known as the Rump Council of Basel. Therefore, on the slide I have up there, the Council of Basel, 1431 to 1439/41, because the Rump Council in Basel stayed on until 1441, but with the transference to Florence Ferrara Florence, that council under Eugenius closed up the shop in 1439, with reunion proclaimed, with the Pope having reasserted supremacy over the council. Things were going seemingly pretty well. Europe didn't want another split. Moreover, East and West had just been joined. Why should we have another split in our camp? So that Rump Council in Basel never really achieved any support politically, except for itself. Yeah. So, 1439. According to Frequens, there should have been a council in 10 years, 1449. Was there a council in 1449? Nope. What about 1459? Nope. 69? Nope. 79? Nope. The next council, the next General Church Council, didn't meet until 1512, the Fifth Lateran Council, which I will get to in later lectures. Already in 1460, Pope Pius II issued his bull Execrabilis. Execrabilis is the Latin, which the English word is execrable, which is just a transliteration of the Latin, which means execrable. This is the worst possible thing you could think of. And Pius, in his bull Execrabilis, condemned conciliarism. He condemned the appeal to a council over or without the authority of the Pope. So he didn't say that every council is illegitimate, but he said any council, any appeal to a council that is not called by the Pope is heretical. The theory that the council is above the Pope is heretical. The council only has authority if and when the Pope calls it. Conciliarism was dead. It was, quote unquote, an option from 1418 to 1460. 42 years. Now, that's the situation we're in, and we'll come back to this after the midterm, when new conflicts are breaking out. Reformation and head members. Next slide. I think I said the basic call to do something about the schism, to deal with all the problems that were going on, the heresy, the crisis. We're in a state of crisis. My God, not only do we have the famine way back when now, if you're 100 years ago, and the plague, which was horrific in the mid-14th century, but by now it's still kind of a factor, even though it's not that big of a deal. It's still an issue because it is endemic. The 30 Years' War supposedly had kind of fizzled out in the first part of the 15th century. The split of Christendom, we've survived. And all of this crisis necessitated a reformation. A reformation in head and members of society at large and the institutional church in specific. Institutional ecclesiastical hierarchy. That was not the only sense in which reformation was used, because this sense of a general reformation that supposedly conciliarism was supposed to address. That was the point. And it did address it in Constance and to an extent in Basel. But with Execrabilis, it had been condemned. Did Reformation really come about? Not as perceived as needed. It ended the crisis of the schism. But with the condemnation of conciliarism, now what? Even earlier on, did the Council of Constance really do what all that it needed? And this is not the only context in which reformation is being called for. And that brings us to the Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund. Something is rotten in the state of Christendom. I hope you recognize that allusion. It goes back to Shakespeare's Hamlet, and something is rotten in the state of Denmark. From the later 14th century on through the 15th century, that was a general sentiment, not just among the church leaders, not just among the lay leaders, but there is something rotten in the state of Christendom. Something must be done, not just in terms of the schism, but in general. And approximately in 1439, with the ending of the Council of Basel, a treatise was issued, an anonymous treatise, with the title The Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund. This is your reading for this week, and this is the basis for your question that you'll need to be answering on midterm 1, which I'll get back to again when I get there. This became one of the most widely spread treatises calling for reformation of the later Middle Ages. We still don't know who the author was. It has been suggested that it was a secular cleric, meaning a priest who maybe had been in attendance at Basel, maybe also had been in attendance at Constance, because as you will see when you read it, it's extremely critical. Now, point 1. Sigismund, the Emperor Sigismund, as I said, had been instrumental in getting the Council of Constance together, had already died. I forget exactly his death date, but certainly long before this treatise ever came out. So it has nothing to do, as such, with the historical Emperor Sigismund. It's called the Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund because it relates, among other things, a vision, supposedly, that the Emperor Sigismund actually had in the early 15th century. Supposedly, Emperor Sigismund had this vision of a reformer to come. And this treatise recounts that vision and offers a program for a comprehensive reformation of church, of head and state, of head and members, for church and state, so to speak. But I hate that dichotomy. I shouldn't have even said it. It shouldn't have come out of my mouth. But for the lay and clerical estate, that's what it's putting forward. You will see that it deals with how to deal with the papacy, what needs to be done for the reformation of the papacy, for the reformation of the College of Cardinals, for the reformation of the bishops and the local priests, local parishes, for tolls, for the princes and how they deal with their subjects. It also condemns indulgences, the fleecing of the people. It is calling for a general reformation. And this vision that it recounts, which it kind of starts out at the beginning with, and it comes back at the end to close it, says, the church is in desperate need still of a thorough reformation. The fathers at Basel or Constance had the opportunity, and they refused to carry it out. Yeah, they ended the schism, but far, far more was needed. And they didn't really care. And the secular princes are as bad as the ecclesiastical princes. They, as it says, basically they showed their ass to the idea of reform. They didn't care. This vision was that God's justice has been abandoned. We are wallowing in our own self-interest. We don't try to follow God or God's will or God's laws. We don't even care about reformation, even though that is precisely what's needed. And God's judgment is coming. God has abandoned us, but he's going to wreak vengeance, and he's going to do so with the rise of a reformer who will be a reformer after the order of Melchizedek, a prince, a king, and a priest, who will come in and institute reformation from above by force. His name will be Frederick of the New Land, Lant Neuen. In the text, but I'm just translating that part for you too. Lant Neuen, the New Land. Frederick will be fierce, so we be sure to wait his coming and be on his side. Otherwise, you will literally have hell to pay. Expect him, wait for him. He's coming. This will happen. That is how the treatise ends, after having gone through the various program for Reformation. And that then echoes too a bit, even though the author probably may or may not have known about Huss's prophecy, maybe, about the swan that was coming, but this reformer to come, who would be a priest king, whose name was Frederick, is important. A reformer and a reformation was exactly what was expected. It was being talked about. It was being hoped for, yearned for, and it never came. Also in the context of increasing apocalyptic expectations, not only due to all the developments I talked about in the previous lecture, but with the split of Christendom, with the church becoming a three-headed monster in terms of the hierarchy and the papacy, with this conflict between the council and the pope, with the pope then condemning calls for councils. It was seen as, what are we going to do about this? How are we to handle this? Is a crisis beyond what we can really comprehend or deal with. And yes, this must be the end of the world. Antichrist must be coming to put an end to all of this. Is that's what the reformer is going to be? The Antichrist before Jesus' final return? How do we handle this? That's the sentiment that was there. Yeah. I have up there too, humanism and reform. I just need to address it. I mean, I think Lindbergh talks about it in the textbook Humanism. I just want to say very brief things about it. Humanism is a complex term to what it refers to. For this course, it refers to primarily the teaching of the humanities, the teaching of the humaniora, as they were called. This is part of the so-called Italian Renaissance. There's a whole course in the Italian Renaissance, where, of course, I would be going through this in far more depth. It's important, though, for the context of what's going to be happening in the 16th century. That's why I'm mentioning it up. And the humanists, as they were called, well, it depends on how we start defining it. Petrarch is often seen as the father of the humanists. Petrarch dies in 1374. He too, as I think I mentioned, referred to the Afghanese papacy as the Babylonian captivity. He was the first poet to receive the poet laureate, the laurel, as the first one since antiquity. He wrote the first epic poem in Latin, his Africa, for which he received the laurel, since Virgil's Aeneid. And so it's based on this development in Italy among Italian scholars who looked back to ancient Rome primarily, but also to ancient Greece, as the model. And they said we should follow these people. And it's not this training at the universities, this scholasticism, the schoolmen, as we're called, scholasticism comes from the schoolmen. The universities, which is focused so heavily on Aristotle, on logic, on the so-called sciences. It is history, literature, poetry, rhetoric, these disciplines that help us understand who we are and how to live. One of the central phrases of the humanist movement was, it's better to do the good than to know the truth. You say, oh yeah, that's kind of weird, isn't it? Well, okay. How many of you, let me ask you, just reflect on this, how many of you do things that you know are bad for you? I do, often. Why do we? Because we want to. We like to. Feels good. That's insane, isn't it? We know the truth, but we don't do it. a way to do the good rather than doing what we want. If you know the truth, you still have to be persuaded to do the truth. That art of persuasion, which is a function of rhetoric, was very much the model in ancient Rome. What do lawyers do? Lawyers have to persuade a judge or jury. The politicians in ancient Rome were all lawyers, as well as politicians, as well as philosophers and statesmen. You have to convince people, persuade people. And is the decision of a judge and or a jury always based on the truth? I hope you don't believe that. It is based on which side, which position was the most persuasive, which presents the evidence in the most compelling manner and fashion. And how do you know how to do that? By reading the classical sources, by reading literature and history and talking about ethics, all these things which were not part of the university curriculum. So humanism became this extra university approach to education, and based on classical models, at least what they thought were classical models, but that gets into too much technicalities, based on literature. And to do that, we have to go back to study Latin and Greek, and actually Greek, especially after the Council of Basel, when you have Greek scholars coming in, starts really taking off in Europe. The desire to go back to the sources and look for the classical sources that maybe we didn't realize that thought had been lost, but we find again. So there's this focus on textual scholarship and textual analysis. In some ways, I mean, this is going a bit too far. In some ways, modern textual analysis and scholarship goes back to the Renaissance. In other ways, we could say it goes back all the way to the Carolingian Renaissance, with the standardization of the biblical text, but that's too far away. But the point here is that this focus on the text and on the original text based on classical models and an educational program based on the humaniora, the liberal arts, the humanistic disciplines, was starting to have a major impact and moved from Italy north of the Alps. And the north of the Alps became referred to increasingly as Christian humanism, whereby it was not just Latin and Greek, but also then Hebrew, because it was like, we can use this program for interpreting the Bible, for studying the Bible, the sacred texts, as well as the church fathers and all the texts of the Christian tradition. We can apply the same means and methods. Humanism was not in the Renaissance period in Italy or north of the Alps an issue of humanity is great. It was not what today has been referred to as secular humanism. It was not against religion. It was not against Christianity whatsoever. It did lead to humanists, teachers of the humanities, the humaniora, just as legal scholars who taught law were referred to as legists, teachers who taught law. Teachers who taught the liberal arts were referred to as artists, teachers of the liberal arts. So were teachers of the humaniora, literature, language, ethics, history, were called humanists, teachers of the humaniora. They were certainly not against Christianity in any way, shape, or form. They could be very critical of the church, or at least the ecclesiastics. They could be critical of the clergy. I think I mentioned anti-clericalism. They could be anti-clerical. But anti-clerical is not anti-Christian. Anti-clerical is not being against religion. Anti-clerical is not being against Christianity. It's not even being against the clergy, because as I think I may have mentioned, I think I did, one form of anti-clericalism has been identified as clerical anti-clericalism. Clergy who are critical of the clergy as such. What do you do about it? It does form part of this crisis, just because it calls into question what had been the assumed proper education for dealing with life It says, no, there is another approach, a kind of outside of the traditional institutions, and a very significant one. I'll come back to some of the impact of humanism on the development, first of all, of Luther and the origins of Luther's Reformation. A significant impact there. It was not simply, you know, armchair theorists or a bunch of disaffected intellectuals. These were people who were heavily involved in city politics, in imperial politics, and they began to be um, hired by princes, by kings, by popes. But hire humanists because, two, persuasion is important for diplomacy, for law, for trying to get what you want in some ways. And so, if you're a pope, you want to have humanists too, because if you can have someone on your side who can argue far more effectively, far more persuasively than if you're in negotiations with the King of France, you can maybe win. You want those people. There's a lot of patronage of humanists by princely courts, including the papal court. That too must be part of it. And they too were calling for reform. Things had to change. Most of the humanists who were calling for reform could see things as bad. One person that actually was in the 16th century, Erasmus of Rotterdam, who became known as the Prince of the Humanists, was very critical of the clergy. He wrote a treatise anonymously called Julius Exclusus. I think I may have referenced that previous lecture too. Where Pope Julius II, who was known as the warrior pope, who actually himself led armies into battle, was excluded from heaven. It's a satire. So they can be very biting. They can be very effective in terms of forming public opinion of other scholars, as well as there were treatises often written simply for other humanists who were had the ability to read the Latin. So there was almost an inside circle that humanists would write for other humanists to look at how brilliant I am and things, as well as then for a broader audience and their constituents in terms of their patrons and so. So it was a very important development, and we'll come back to that again later. That's kind of the origins of it, and it kind of contributes to this crisis of things aren't working. Things have to be different. We have to change how we go about doing things because things have gotten so bad that Reformation was our only hope. It was not an option anymore. It was the last hope for the church. It was our last chance before it would all end. Because the end of the world was coming. Things have gotten so bad. What do? The only thing we can do is try to bring about a reformation and wait for the reformer to come, the priest king Frederick, who will institute reformation by force from above. Now, that can be a little less painful if we start on that process ourselves before he gets here. It's our last hope. That's what it was about. And part of that was then also what's become known as the observant movement. This slide, the observant movement. The observant movement was a movement within the monastic orders, particularly within the mendicants, Franciscans, Dominicans, and Augustinians. And it, to make a long story short, and again, I'm going to keep this somewhat short, it was based on an administrative split within the orders, whereby there was a faction, the observants, as they became known as, who wanted to go back and thoroughly observe the rule and constitution of their order. The order had kind of fallen away, wayside and become lax. They needed to effect a reformation of their order, a reformation of how they were living. Now, those who did not adhere to that faction were called the conventuals. No, everything's just fine. Became attention to the order. And orders became split administratively, and eventually, with the Franciscans, it ended up into a new religious order, with their own kind of separate, a complete split. Augustinians and Dominicans was more of a faction and a branch. I know a lot more about the Augustinians than I do about the Franciscans and Dominicans. Also, the Benedictines, there was a common observant movement. There's this movement to really observe the ideals. And it was often instituted from above. We've had administrative sources. The administrative sources we have refer to introducing the Reformation in a given cloister, in a given city. This would lead to princes who would introduce the Reformation amongst their monastic orders and their territories. And we know it from that top-down approach. Well, it starts, though, from bottom up. And that's where I have up there Antonius Rampogolis and his Figurae Bibliorum, OESA, Ordinance from Below. This is somebody I've worked on a fair amount and will still be doing so. He's not gotten very much attention at all, but he should have. He was an Augustinian friar, 14th century on into the early 15th century. I could say a lot about him. I won't. Figurae Bibliorum was a very popular book of his that spread widespread. It was essentially a handbook for preachers to offer them biblical interpretation with examples so they could easily plug it into their sermons. But I'm not going to say too much more about that because it would, again, take us too far off of the topic at hand. But one of the things that's so important about him is in his section on the religious. The Figurae Bibliorum is organized topically and alphabetically. To say a lot about it, but again, one of the topics he deals with on the religious, on the monastic orders. And in this section, he says, you know what? There are three orders, the Franciscans, Augustinians, and Dominicans, whom God has given the understanding of Scripture. But yet not all of the Augustinians, Franciscans, and Dominicans have that understanding, have that divine favor with God. But only the pure, only the good, not the depraved and the pseudo mendicants who don't live up to their ideals. Only those who truly follow their ideals are the chosen ones of God through whom God speaks, revealing the secrets of Scripture and how to know them. And to keep those chosen ones, so to speak, pure, they need to be kept separate from the rabble. That focus on separation, and we first see it in the first kind of earliest version of his treatise, 1354. Which then there's 1377, 1384. It's printed multiple times, and on we go. But already right here we see the origins of the observance and this desire to say, I and my little group here are going to bring about a reformation from bottom up, from within. And to do so, we need to be kept separate from those people out there. It makes sense. It makes perfect sense if you think about it. It only then later became administratively separate. Now, administrative split. The Augustinians is 1378. It's the first documents we have when the prior general order gave permission for the monastery in Lecceto to be directly under his own authority rather than the normal structure. So what we have within then developing the Mendicant orders are two different branches. We have the prior general, and then we have district vicars or provincial priors, district vicars, and then individual priors. But this then added a branch for the observance. So we have the conventuals here and the observance here, both under the prior general, but they're in conflict. And they have their own administrative structure that is distinct from what has always been traditionally the administrative structure. It's all underneath the prior general, who is underneath the Pope. So if you are a provincial prior of an observant congregation, you don't have to worry what all the others are doing, because you are right underneath the prior general. You have their special authority and privilege of the prior general supporting you. That is an important context because Luther was a member of the observant congregation of the Augustinian hermits in Erfurt. We'll get back to that, but this is the context and the origins. And their whole view was that we observants, are the last hope for the church. We are the ones to whom God has given the understanding of scriptures. And if we don't understand the scriptures, what are we going to do? We're lost. We have this urgent mission to bring about a reformation not only internally with us, but also for the church at large. And we do that by means of preaching and teaching the scriptures based on what we know. Now that is going to be, unfortunately, the best I can do, just time-wise, not the best I can do. I shouldn't say that at all, but I'll really have time for here, but I think it will help, the essential help to understanding what's going to be happening after the midterm, so to speak, in this course when we get to Luther. But it's part of this late medieval crisis, this late medieval call for reformation, and what to do about it in this urgent context. And that endeavor to bring the monastic ideals to everybody based on our unique understanding of the scriptures that God has given us, because we are observant. We are following our ideals. That did have an impact in society at large. And that leads me to religionization and lay piety. And I've already mentioned that the beginning of second lecture for this week, part one, that one of the distinctions that makes between religionization and Christian and confessionalization. Basically, we can look at three broad processes in the history of Christianity. One, Christianization, which is an earlier medieval aspect whereby Christianization is a process or processes by which people within a given territory become Christian, defined as acceptance of baptism and attending Christian worship. By approximately the year 1000, the Christianization process within Europe, Christendom, was almost basically complete, except for the Jews, of course. But then we have this kind of secondary Christianization process, which I call religionization, which was the pastoral endeavor to teach and to preach to people, saying, okay, now that you're Christian, we need to teach you what it means to be Christian and how to live a Christian life. That begins in this pastoral endeavor of the 11th, 12th century. It really starts picking up and just gets a big impetus with the mendicants, because they are by design, by papal designation, sent to teach and preach in the cities, to win souls. It's part of this general late medieval catechetical endeavor, which is one of the issues up there. As we'll see later, there was no such thing as the catechism in the later Middle Ages. That was a development actually of Luther as a genre. The Catechism, Luther's Small Catechism, in I think it's 1529. To go back and check, was the first of its type. There was a lot of catechetical literature, treatises on the Ten Commandments, on the Lord's Prayer. One I've studied a lot myself, and actually published an edition and translation of it is Jordan of Quedlinburg's an Augustinian hermit, 14th century Augustinian hermit's exposition of the Lord's Prayer. The Ave Maria, those are the basics. Oh, and the Creed. Creed, the Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments, and the Ave Maria. That had to be preached and taught. And how was it? At Mass. There'd be sermons on these things too. So preaching was a major avenue of teaching, of catechesis, because what does catechesis actually mean? It's Greek. It goes back to just education and teaching. The Catechizandis Rudibus is the treatise that Augustine wrote on how to teach the unlearned for Christians, for Christianity. That process was going on and increasing, and let's say encapsulated by my Augustine and Jordan of Quedlinburg, whom I've written the most about, in his statement in his sermon that every Christian should be a saint. So it's not just the religious, it's not just the monks and the friars. Every Christian is to be a saint and bright and shining. That attempt to say that living the Christian life means that you have to be a saint. And you can do so not by joining a religious order, but by being a Christian in society was a huge shift and change. And Jordan said that in a sermon, in one of his sermons, De Sanctis, on the saints, which is was by 1380 because his death was in 1380, so it was before 1380 when he says that. And his sermons were published later in his treatise on the saints, which too is a catechetical treatise because he's preaching on saints. And what is a saint? A saint is someone as a hero that we hold up. Should we emulate to a degree? And for Jordan, it's like all of a sudden it's not just these heroes who we can't really, because not everybody can be like that. But we can be a saint in that we can pursue that holiness, and God will give us the grace to help us so that we all can be saints. And the communion of saints, the communio sanctorum, is what the communio fidelium should be, the church. The communio fidelium, the communion of the faithful, should actually be the communio sanctorum, the communion of all the saints. Now, within that general approach of Jordan and the late medieval catechetical endeavor of the mendicants as such, there's also a movement called the modern devotion, the Devotio Moderna, which was a lay movement in northern Germany, the Netherlands, primarily, that sought to live a monastic life but in society. They would say, could we modern devout? There were brothers and sisters of the common life, as they were called. And they did have a kind of monastic faction whereby they live in a cloister, a community, but remained living within society as well. They had their jobs in society, so they weren't all self-sustained, but they just kind of lived together, kind of like a commune. I don't know if any of you know what the communes used to be like in the 60s and 70s, but it's like we group together and live together, but we still have our independent jobs and everything, and we kind of share and work. That's like these convents of the lay devotion, the brothers and sisters of the common life who were separate, but both had the same thing. And then there were male communities and female communities. Would still be in part of society, and then there was also just the more general adherence to this ideal of Christian piety and lay devotion. And it was kind of a monastic approach, though without living within a convent. So those are the two factions of it. And scholars have talked about how, in the later Middle Ages, we see the religion, the concept of religion and late piety and devotion within the monastery spilling over the walls and trying to go out to all of society. And this was kind of part of that. This general approach that we see with Jordan already in the mid-14th century or later mid-14th century. And it just picks up in the 15th century. The modern devotion is late 14th. And one of the primary treatises of the modern devotion was by a man by the name of Thomas à Kempis, who was Dutch, from Kippen, The Imitation of Christ. It became one of the most widely spread treatises. So it's kind of a devotional movement, a sense that, in Jordan's terms, even though he was not, Jordan cannot be considered part of the modern devotion. Keep that in mind. That then was to enliven Christianity with a sense of, it's urgent. We have to bring about a reformation of ourselves, of Christian life, of Christians, because the last days are at our hand. That's all that we have to do. So this upsurge in personal devotion, the focus on living a Christian life, being a saint, based on the late medieval canonical endeavor, of which then the modern devotion, the Devotio Moderna, was a particular form in Northern Europe, led to this sense of we can do something. And I have it there too, the pastoral theology. Um, and for those who do what is in him, God will not deny his grace, because it gets to be a problem, especially if we're talking to the laity. It's like, oh gosh, I can't really join a monastery. I'm married. I have kids. If I really want to be devout, what do I do? I see Jesus said, to the rich young man, rich young man says, Lord, what do I need to do to be saved? And he says, well, do you keep the commandments? And he says, yeah, I've kept the commandments all my life. He says, well, to be perfect, you need to sell all you have and come follow me. And the rich young man goes away and distraught because he was wealthy and didn't want to really do that. We don't know what really happened. But here it's like, okay, if you're going to completely devote yourself to God, how do you go about doing so? Well, the traditional way was always you join a monastic order. You actually enter religion, as it was called, entering the state of religion, in statu religionis, whereby the religious, the religioni, those who were monastic, became almost a group apart. So that if you were not a member of a monastic group, you weren't really religious in a legal sense. And that's a distinction that needs to be made, because Jordan, too, and this is that every Christian ought to be a saint, also said, and everybody can be a religious. You can take a private vow of completely devoting yourself to living a Christian life. That, too, qualifies for being in statu religionis. So this monastic definition of the religious life is being applied to everyone within Christendom. But there's a problem there, because if you not enter a monastery, if you say, okay, you know what, I wish I could, but I can't because I'm married with children, for example, or I'm not really sure I want to go all that way. Does that mean I'm not going to achieve my salvation? Because if I can't be perfect, what can I do? Am I damned? Now that goes all the way back to that concept of perfection, to the 4th, 5th century controversies surrounding Augustine of Hippo, primarily Donatism and Pelagianism. By Augustine argued for the common Christian. No, we can't be perfect. It's impossible to be perfect. It's not about us, it's about what God does. And our salvation is based on God's gift to us, not what we do. And the sacraments from Donatism, not based on the moral quality of the priest, but it's based on God working. Christianity is for everybody, not just the perfect. Fine, but then what do we do? How do we live? Does that mean we don't have to worry about and care? Or how do we go about living our lives? And one approach, especially in the mid to later 15th century, on into the early 16th century, the preachers, whether they be members of the mendicant orders, they too though, or secular clergy or theologians, came up with was to say, don't worry if you can't be perfect. Do what you can. Just do your best, because God will not deny his grace to those who are doing their best, to those that are doing what they can, to those that are doing what is in them. And that's the Latin phrase facientibus quod in se est, non denigrat gratiam. To those who are doing what is in them, God will not deny his grace. That was supposed to be a pastoral means of relieving anxiety, of relieving tension, to do what is in. Just do what you can. You can't be perfect, but do what you can, and God will not deny his grace. That was this attempt to say, okay, this is another aspect of bringing religionization to everyone, making everyone strive to be a saint, to be a religious. And even if you can't be perfectly that, you can at least strive for it and try, and that is good enough. Because if you just try and do what you can, God will grant you his grace. Now, we will see that coming back to be a problem with Luther. Because Luther then asked the question, how do I know if I am doing what is in me? How do I know if I am doing my best? What is my best? I'm damned. We'll get there when we get there. But the point is that original attempt to relieve anxiety became the source of anxiety. But here, as we're talking about it, as we get into from the later 14th on into the 15th century, this appeal to say, just do what you can, was an attempt to say, okay, even if you cannot affect a reformation, can you affect a reform? Now, reform and reformation. That's all part of this lay piety, religionization. And what's the difference between reform and reformation? I said, I think earlier on to start all this too, that the Reformation, what I've referred to as the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, failed in that it did not bring about major structural changes within the institutions of society. It wasn't for lack of trying. It wasn't lack of calling for the need, the recognition of the need for it. So do we call this just late medieval reform? Or do we recognize the urgency that was there and see to it as a reformation, a call for reformation in headed members of individuals, of society, of structures and policies that just didn't come about? No, there's no way to answer that question. I think historically speaking, if we don't see the urgency of calls for reformation and try to understand what the people at the time, the people in the 14th and on into the 15th century, what they understood by the term reformatio or reformation, we shouldn't then undermine that and belittle it by saying, yes, but it really wasn't reformation, it was simply reform. Nor should we say that reform and even calls for reformation in the later Middle Ages were simply desires to go back to some golden age in the past. No, it was to transform society of the time. And this is where my perspective kind of is different from even that of the textbook and majority of what you might read about the Reformation and the later Middle Ages. Because we will not understand the historical development without seeing that there was a legitimate reformation of the later Middle Ages within the context of a general crisis and urgency when apocalyptic expectations of the end of the world being imminent was there, and the only hope was to effect and bring about a reformation. And if we don't, the reformer is coming who will impose it from above. That was the sentiment. If we can't get that and simply say, oh, these are just late medieval reform movements, we're not understanding the historical development. That's what I want to get across to you. And then we'll see how that provides the context for what was going to be happening as we go into the 16th century when we get there, and another Reformation movements, or Reformation movements, as we will see, that also have been argued to have failed, depending on how it's defined. But we'll get there when we get there. And here, though, we sum up this first part of the course, the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, which is essential for understanding developments thereafter. That being said, now move on to midterm 1, which is due, it's due basically, forget exact date I give as the due date, May 19th, I forget off the top of my head precisely when that was, but it's there on the syllabus, it's there in the assignments, and your midterm essentially is one question, dealing with the Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund. What you'll need to do for that is, first of all, analyze the question. The questions I ask, the essay questions I ask, are impossible. You can't answer them. There's no right or wrong answer. And if you were to try to thoroughly, comprehensively answer them, you'd have to write at least a complete book, if not several. The basis for my grading your exam is how well you apply the course material, namely the assigned readings, textbook sources, and the lectures to deal with the problem that's given you. I would strongly suggest to read or reread the document Historical Argumentation in the module course documents, because you will need to present an argument. And your essay will be evaluated, graded, based on my estimation of how well you have understood, grasped, taken into account the course material, putting it all together, and applying it to a given problem. There's no need to do any further research. If you refer to something that is not part of the course material, could that help? Potentially. Could also be rather damning, because if you don't get it right, or if you appeal to something that is contradicted by the course material, that will be bad. Because the basis of your grade, the textbook, the lectures, and the assigned readings. Analyze it. Think about it. And analyze the question. What is it really asking? And there's different parts to it. When you look at the midterm question, you'll see, okay, to what extent was the Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund representative of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages? Fine, that's the starting point in the core, but then there's other aspects to that question as well. The key is to do a detailed analysis of the text within the context of the course material to then make general statements informing an historical argument. Relate the general to the detail and relate the detail to the general statements. So the question is general, so you're going to have to answer it in the general. The Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund was representative of what has been called the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, even if it does not encapsulate the totality thereof, or something along those lines. We can see this in X, Y, and Z specific details, including analyzing the text itself. To what extent does it represent Reformation of the later Middle Ages? To what extent does it not? Do not ignore the details of the text itself. Do not ignore the details of the course material in formulating your argument. You need to be persuasive. You need to take that kind of humanistic lawyer approach. And in the document Historical Argument, I make the analogy between historical argument and legal argument. You are presenting a case before the judge. I'm the judge and jury, and you have to persuade me that you understand and that your position is the correct one or the best one. There's no right or wrong answers. There are good answers or bad answers. And when you present your case, when you submit your exam, you should be aware that what you're doing is representing yourself. Put your best foot forward. Follow the directions. Follow the guidelines. And know that I can only grade what you submit. I can't read your mind. I can't say, oh, I know what you really meant to do. I know that you didn't mean to submit this exam in the chiller font. That will irritate me, if that makes sense. Okay. Times New Roman. So if you have any questions about the exam, please email me. Okay. It's the best thing to do. We can chat over email. I'm certainly open and happy to have to schedule a Zoom session with you to talk about it as well, because this is important for you and your grade. And I want you to get as much out of this as you possibly can in terms of understanding. That's what it's all about. It's coming to an understanding of the sources that exist that signify the past and how we have come to be where we are. Now, That being said, I wish you all good luck. Again, if there's any problems, reach out to me. If you have any questions, reach out to me. I'm here to help. That is my, as I see as my function. I'm here to help. So kind of use me. That's what I consider. That's what I'm for. Not just to talk at you, to lecture at you, to try to excite you and give you perspective and insight. I'm also here to help. So use me. That being said, good luck with the midterm, and we'll pick it back up after the midterm with part 2 of the course and go on from there. Thank you so much.